My parents injected me with stimulants to awaken my superior DNA and locked me in a room wired to electrocute me if I slept. When I begged them to stop, my mom whispered, "Sleep is death for the weak. You'll thank us once you transcend." I stayed silent. That was 9 months ago. This morning, she woke up screaming and didn't know where she was. When did obsession go way too far? My parents kept me awake for days at a time because they believed sleep was a weakness that only inferior people needed, and true genetic champions could function without it. Mom and Dad met at a biohacking conference where extremists discussed transcending human limitations through willpower and chemistry. They'd both trained themselves to sleep only 2 hours per night using a combination of stimulants and meditation techniques they claimed activated dormant DNA. Our house was lit 24 hours a day with industrial lighting because darkness triggered what they called primitive sleep responses. I grew up thinking it was normal to hallucinate from exhaustion and that other kids were lazy for needing 8 hours of sleep. My parents started my sleep deprivation training when I turned 5 with gentle methods like ice water baths and loud alarms every time my eyes closed. By age 10, I was on a strict regime of 2 hours of sleep maximum, with the rest of the time devoted to what they called consciousness expansion exercises. These involved staring at strobe lights while reciting multiplication tables or doing push-ups whenever I felt drowsy. The real torture began when I hit puberty, and my body desperately needed more sleep to develop properly. My parents saw this as weakness trying to corrupt their genetically superior daughter, and tripled down on the deprivation protocols. They hired a man named Dr. Volkov, who'd been expelled from multiple countries for human experimentation, but claimed he could eliminate the need for sleep entirely. He injected me with cocktails of stimulants that made my heart race so fast I thought it would explode. When those stopped working, he moved to electrical shocks administered through a vest I had to wear that would zap me whenever my brain waves indicated approaching sleep. I'd jump and convulse every few minutes while trying to do homework. My older sister Jade had gone through this program before me, and the results were horrifying. She'd been beautiful and brilliant before the sleep deprivation, but now at 20, she looked like a walking corpse with hollow eyes and trembling hands. She'd developed seizures from the constant stimulation and could only speak in fragmented sentences because her brain couldn't form coherent thoughts anymore. Mom called her a success story because she literally couldn't fall asleep anymore, even when she tried. 7 years without proper sleep and still functional, Mom would brag to other biohacking parents. What she didn't mention was that Jade had tried to cull herself 3 times because the hallucinations and paranoia had become unbearable. One day I found Dr. Volkov's real research files on his laptop while he was preparing my injections. He wasn't trying to eliminate sleep at all, but was using us as test subjects for military-grade interrogation drugs. The file on me included notes about how long a teenage girl could go without sleep before complete psychological breakdown, and what combinations of drugs caused the most vivid hallucinations. He'd been selling his research to foreign governments interested in enhanced interrogation techniques. Even worse were his notes about the terminal phase, where subjects either died from organ failure or entered permanent psychosis. According to his timeline, I had maybe 2 months before reaching that point. I tried to confront my parents, but they'd been taking the same drugs for so long that paranoia and reality had blurred together. Mom accused me of being a corporate spy sent to sabotage their evolution into sleepless superhumans. Dad started ranting about how sleep was a government conspiracy to keep populations docile and controllable. I realized they weren't evil, just completely insane from years of sleep deprivation and stimulants. But that didn't make them less dangerous when I threatened to expose Dr. Volkov. Mom locked me in what they called the waking room, which had strobe lights, electric floors, and speakers that played frequency waves designed to prevent sleep. "Just a few more treatments and you'll break through to permanent wakefulness," she promised. I pretended to embrace their ideology to get them to lower their guard and started asking Dr. Volkov questions about his research like I wanted to help. He was so excited to have an engaged subject that he showed me his whole setup, including where he kept his experimental compounds. I waited until my parents were in one of their meditation sessions and stole the strongest sedatives from his collection. The plan was to knock them out and escape while they were unconscious. I mixed the sedatives into the protein shakes they drank every 4 hours to maintain their energy. Within 20 minutes, both my parents were stumbling and confused, fighting against their first real drowsiness in years. "She's trying to make us sleep," Mom screamed, but her eyes were already rolling back. They both collapsed hard, their bodies going limp in a way I'd never seen before. I felt a moment of triumph until I noticed they weren't moving at all. Their breathing was so shallow I could barely see their chests rise. That's when Dr. Volkov arrived for my evening injection and found them unconscious on the floor. His face went from confusion to rage to something worse when he checked their pulses. "You stupid girl," he whispered, backing away from me. "Do you know what happens when someone who hasn't slept properly in years suddenly goes under? Their brains can't handle the shock." He pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "Bodies that exhausted don't wake up, they just stop." I watched in horror as he dialed 911, my parents still motionless on the floor. "I need police and ambulances immediately," he said, staring straight at me. I just witnessed a double murder. The sirens screamed down our street and I backed away from my parents' bodies, my legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. The paramedics burst through our front door within minutes, their equipment cases banging against the walls as they rushed past me. I pressed myself against the kitchen counter while they swarmed around my parents' motionless bodies on the living room floor, checking vitals and shouting medical terms I didn't understand. Dr. Volkov stood calmly by the door, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't read, like he was studying a lab rat. The lead paramedic, a woman with gray hair pulled back tight, announced that both patients were in respiratory depression while she prepared IV lines. My mother's face looked peaceful for the first time in years, free from the manic energy that usually animated her features. No more twitching or constant movement. The guilt hit me like a physical blow because I just wanted them to sleep. Not this. Not whatever was happening as they stuck needles in their arms and oxygen masks over their faces. Detective Martinez arrived as they were loading my parents onto gurneys, her sharp eyes taking in everything. The industrial lighting that never turned off, the strange equipment scattered everywhere, the medical vials on our coffee table. She introduced herself while pulling out a notepad notepad, her voice professionally neutral as she asked Dr. Volkov what happened here. Before I could speak, Dr. Volkov pointed at me and said she drugged them, that he arrived for their scheduled session and found me standing over their bodies. He claimed the sedatives came from his medical bag, that I must have stolen them during our last appointment, his accent getting thicker with what sounded like distress, but I knew was just another performance. I tried to explain about the sleep deprivation, the experiments, the years of torture, but the words tumbled out in fragments that didn't make sense. The detective's expression shifted from neutral to concerned as she took in my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, my trembling hands, the way I flinched when Dr. Volkov moved closer to whisper something to her. She said we should continue this at the station, carefully, like she was talking to someone dangerous or crazy. The ride in the police car felt surreal, watching my neighborhood pass by through the metal grate while my parents were rushed to the hospital in ambulances. The interrogation room's fluorescent lights made me dizzy after the chaos at home, everything too bright and too quiet at the same time. Detective Martinez set a recorder on the table while I gulped down the coffee she offered, my first non-stimulant drink in weeks, the warmth spreading through my chest. She told me to start from the beginning, to tell her about my family, so I did. I described the biohacking conferences where my parents met, the sleep elimination protocols they developed together, how they bonded over their shared obsession with transcending human limitations through chemistry and willpower. The detective took notes steadily, occasionally asking for clarification about specific drugs or treatments, her pen scratching across the paper. When I mentioned Jade's seizures and suicide attempts, she paused and asked where my sister was now. I whispered that she was in a psychiatric facility in Denver, that she'd been there 6 months, and the doctor said the damage might be permanent from 7 years without proper sleep. The detective made a note to verify this, and I felt a spark of hope because someone was finally listening, really listening, and Dr. Volkov wasn't here to contradict me or twist my words into something else. 3 hours later, they moved me to a different room with softer lighting where a social worker waited, my body screaming for sleep, but I forced myself to stay alert, terrified that dozing off would make me look guilty or weak. The hallucinations were getting worse, shadows moving in my peripheral vision, whispers that weren't there, bugs crawling on the walls that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Nathan Cross from Child Protective Services introduced himself with genuine warmth that felt different from the detective's professional distance, like he actually cared what happened to me. The timing of Dr. Volkov pulling out those files seems awfully convenient. Why would he leave such damaging evidence on an unlocked laptop where she could find it? Makes me wonder if there's something else going on with him showing her everything so willingly later too. He said he'd seen cases involving extreme parenting ideologies before, but nothing quite like this, that we needed to get me medical attention immediately before the sleep deprivation caused permanent damage like it did to Jade. The first thing Nathan did was take me to the hospital where they ran blood tests that showed levels of stimulants that made the nurses look at each other with worried faces. My hands shook so bad I couldn't hold the water cup they gave me, and when the doctor shined a light in my eyes, I flinched away because even that small brightness felt like knives in my brain. They started me on IV fluids and gave me something to help with the shaking, while Nathan sat in the corner making phone calls to arrange emergency placement at a group home for kids in crisis situations. The next few days blurred together as my body crashed hard from years of forced wakefulness, sleeping 18 hours at a time and waking up confused about where I was or what had happened. Nathan visited every day with updates about the investigation and helped me understand that what my parents did wasn't normal parenting gone too far, but actual abuse that had nearly killed me. He arranged for me to meet with a therapist who specialized in helping kids who'd been in cults, which felt weird to hear because I'd always thought cults were religious groups in compounds, not families in regular houses. The therapist explained that my parents had created their own mini cult around the idea of transcending human limits through sleep deprivation, with Dr. Volkov as their guru figure who validated their dangerous beliefs. She said the hardest part would be learning to trust my own thoughts again after years of being told my need for sleep was weakness. Nathan brought news that made my stomach drop when he told me investigators had found connections between my parents and a whole network of extreme biohackers online who shared tips about pushing human limits. The community called themselves human optimization enthusiasts and had forums full of people bragging about how little they slept or what chemicals they used to stay awake longer. Several members had written statements supporting Dr. Volkov's credentials, all using weirdly similar phrases about pioneering the future of human potential. The detective called me back to the police station where she showed me security footage from a pharmacy that made my heart sink. There I was on grainy black and white video buying sleep aids 6 weeks before everything happened, which Dr. Volkov was using as evidence that I'd been planning to drug my parents all along. I tried to explain that I'd been desperate for anything to help me sleep normally, that the over-the-counter pills barely worked against the stimulants in my system, but her face stayed neutral in that cop way that meant she wasn't convinced. My state-issued phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize that made my hands shake when I read it. The message said Jade wanted to talk to me and remembered things about the doctor that might help my case. Nathan saw my face go pale and read the message over my shoulder, immediately calling the detective to report it because it could be a trap, or it could be real help from my sister. After a week of legal discussions and safety planning, Nathan drove me to Denver to visit the psychiatric facility where Jade lived. The drive felt endless with flat brown landscapes stretching forever, while I tried to prepare myself for seeing what the sleep deprivation had done to my sister. The facility looked like a cross between a hospital and a prison with locked doors that buzzed when we entered, and staff who watched everything with careful eyes. Jade looked worse than I remembered from the last time I'd seen her, so thin her bones showed through her hospital gown, and her eyes unfocused like she was seeing things that weren't there. But when she saw me, something shifted in her face, and she whispered my name like she was trying to hold on to reality. She asked if it was true about our parents in a voice so small it broke my heart. Her words came in broken pieces between moments where she'd drift away and stare at nothing, but slowly she told me things that made Nathan pull out his notebook. She remembered Dr. Volkov talking about other families he'd worked with before us, mentioning names when he thought she was too far gone to understand or remember. The Morrison twins stuck in her mind because he'd said they didn't survive the terminal phase of sleep deprivation, which meant there were other kids out there who'd died from his experiments. Nathan immediately started making calls to authorities in other states, asking about missing children named Morrison, while the psychiatric staff confirmed they'd heard Jade mention these names before, but assumed it was part of her delusions. Her medical medical records showed she'd been trying to communicate something for months, but nobody had taken it seriously because she was so sick. Back at the group home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. A car would sit outside for hours with someone inside who'd drive away whenever staff members went out to check. Other kids mentioned seeing a man who looked like Dr. Volkov asking questions about me at the stores near the facility. Nathan increased security protocols and made sure staff knew to watch for anyone trying to get information about me. The call about my parents came while I was in therapy, trying to process everything that had happened. Dad had developed pneumonia from being on the ventilator so long, and Mom's brain scans showed no activity at all. The hospital ethics committee needed to meet about end-of-life care, and as their only family member who wasn't in a psychiatric facility, they needed my input about what to do. The weight of having to make that choice felt like drowning when I was barely keeping my own head above water. Dr. Foster sat with me after the meeting where I'd barely been able to speak through the tears. She was nothing like Dr. Volkov with his cold calculations, and she held my hand while explaining that the years of stimulant abuse had left their bodies unable to handle the sudden sedation. She said it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have known giving them sedatives would cause their systems to shut down, but knowing that didn't make the guilt any lighter. 2 weeks passed in a blur of medical appointments and CPS meetings before Nathan burst into my hospital room with his laptop open, and a woman on video call who introduced herself as a forum moderator from one of the biggest biohacking communities online. She'd seen the news coverage about my parents and recognized their usernames from years of increasingly disturbing posts about sleep deprivation experiments on their children. Her screen shared dozens of posts where Mom bragged about keeping us awake for days using ice baths and electrical shocks, while other parents cheered her on and asked for tips. The worst posts mentioned a doctor, V, who sold them research chemicals and consultation sessions for thousands of dollars, promising to unlock human potential through extreme sleep restriction. Nathan's fingers flew across the keyboard as the moderator sent him archived payment records from the forum's marketplace, where parents bought stimulants and shock devices. The transactions went back 5 years, with over 12 families making regular purchases from accounts linked to Dr. Volkov's email addresses. One family caught my attention because their payments stopped abruptly 3 years ago after months of posts about their twin teenagers experiencing seizures and hallucinations. The moderator remembered them because other parents had asked where they went and never got answers. Nathan printed everything while I stared at post after post of parents documenting their children's suffering like science experiments. Detective Martinez arrived within an hour of Nathan calling her, and her whole attitude changed as she reviewed the evidence. She admitted they'd been tracking Dr. Volkov for months after getting reports from hospitals about teenagers arriving with organ failure and extreme sleep deprivation, but they hadn't been able to connect him directly to the cases until now. She explained that he'd been trying to leave the country but kept getting flagged at airports because of the ongoing investigation. She needed more concrete evidence to arrest him for the earlier cases, but the forum posts and payment records were building a clear pattern of systematic abuse. The next morning, I sat in a different therapist's office because the hospital said I needed trauma counseling before testifying. The therapist listened as I explained about the forum posts and the other families, and suddenly I couldn't stop crying because maybe if I told someone sooner, those twins in Oregon would still be alive. She reminded me I was a child who'd been conditioned since age 5 to see the abuse as normal, and that survival wasn't selfishness, but I couldn't shake the image of those parents making final posts about their kids having seizures. That night back at the group home, I tried to sleep, but my body wouldn't let me even with the mild sedatives Dr. Foster prescribed. Every time I started drifting off, my heart would race, and I'd jolt awake in panic like Mom was about to throw ice water on me, or Dr. Volkov was coming with his shock vest. Dr. Foster warned that recovery would take months or maybe years because my brain needed to relearn that sleep was safe after a decade of torture. She increased the dosage but said medication could only do so much when the trauma was this deep. 3 weeks later, Nathan got a call from investigators in Oregon who'd finally tracked down the family from the forum posts. Both twins had died within months of each other from organ failure consistent with extreme sleep deprivation, just like the posts had suggested. Their parents were devastated and drowning in guilt, but agreed to speak with investigators about Dr. Volkov's role in their children's deaths. So the forum moderator shows up with receipts like she's been running the world's most disturbing scrapbook club. Look everyone, here's where parents compared torture techniques. Their story matched ours exactly, from the consultation fees to the research chemicals to the escalating protocols that pushed young bodies past their limits. Nathan added their testimony to the growing case file while I wondered how many other families were out there hiding their dead children and their shame. Then Dr. Volkov made his biggest mistake by having his lawyer send me a letter offering to drop his guardianship petition if I recanted my statements about the experiments. The letter included comments about my fragile mental state and how tragic it would be if I followed Jade's path, which Nathan immediately recognized as witness intimidation. He filed the letter as evidence while calling the detective to report the threat. Within days, the district attorney's office finally agreed to meet with us about filing charges. The prosecutor explained they couldn't charge Dr. Volkov with murder, but they had enough for practicing medicine without a license, child endangerment, and now witness intimidation. It wasn't enough considering what he'd done, but she said my testimony about the pattern of abuse would be crucial for getting any conviction at all. I agreed to testify even though the thought of facing him in court made me shake. The next week, I went to visit Jade at the psychiatric facility and brought a box of photos from before the experiment started. She usually just stared at walls and mumbled fragments, but when I showed her a picture of us as little kids at the park before the sleep deprivation began, her eyes focused on it. Her finger traced our smiling faces, and she said clearly, "I remember being happy," which was the most coherent sentence she'd managed in months. The nurses said it was a breakthrough, but I just held her hand and cried because that happiness was gone forever. That night at dinner in the group home, the phone rang and staff called me over with a strange expression. The hospital was calling to inform me that Mom had died an hour ago when her body simply gave out after weeks in a coma. I hung up and walked back to the table where the other kids had gone silent because everyone knew I was the girl who drugged her parents, and now one of them was dead. The truth about the sleep deprivation and Dr. Volkov's experiments felt too complicated to explain when the simple fact was that I'd given her those sedatives, and now she was gone. 2 days later, I stood at the front of the funeral home watching people from Mom's biohacking community file in, like they were attending some kind of scientific conference instead of a funeral. They wore strange fitness trackers and talked in hushed voices about optimization protocols and transcendence theories, while I tried not to scream that their ideas had killed her. One woman with hollow cheeks and twitching hands approached me near the casket and whispered that Mom had been so close to breaking through that I'd robbed her of transcendence by forcing sleep on her body. Nathan stepped between us before I could respond, but her words kept echoing in my head as more of these walking skeletons filled the room. The funeral director pulled me aside afterward to mention that several odd visitors had been asking about the cause of death and trying to obtain tissue samples for research purposes. He'd refused, of course, but it was clear that Dr. Volkov's influence went way beyond just our family. Nathan arranged for increased security and immediate cremation to prevent any unauthorized access to Mom's body. Back at the group home, I went through the box of Mom's personal effects the hospital had given me, mostly just clothes and her collection of biohacking books, when my fingers found something hard wrapped in a sock. It was an encrypted USB drive that took me 3 tries to unlock using variations of her favorite optimization mantras as passwords. The drive contained years of video diaries showing Mom's descent from an excited woman talking about human potential to a rambling skeleton convinced she was becoming a new species. The early videos showed her almost normal, just enthusiastic about pushing boundaries and maximizing performance. By the end, she could barely form coherent sentences between the tremors and paranoid rants about government agents trying to force sleep on the evolved humans. But the most important videos weren't her diary entries. Hidden in a folder labeled protocols were recordings of Dr. Volkov in our house directing my parents to increase my dosages despite my obvious distress. In one video, I was convulsing on the floor while he calmly told them I was more resilient than previous subjects who couldn't handle the protocol. He mentioned other families by name, other kids who'd been part of his experiments. I immediately called Detective Martinez, who drove over within an hour to collect the evidence. 3 days later, the news showed Dr. Volkov being arrested at the airport with a fake passport and tickets to Belarus. He maintained his innocence even in handcuffs, claiming he was a victim of a disturbed teenager's delusions, but other families were already coming forward with their own horror stories. The evidence was mounting faster than his lawyer could spin it. A week after that, I sat in the hospital room where Dad remained on life support, his brain showing minimal activity according to the monitors. The doctors explained that his body was technically alive, but there was nothing left of the person he'd been. I talked to him about normal things like weather and school, anything except how we'd ended up here, while holding his cold hand that never squeezed back. The grand jury hearing began 2 weeks later with me testifying via closed-circuit video from a separate room to avoid facing Dr. Volkov directly. I detailed years of experiments, the injections, the electric shocks, the way he'd manipulated my parents' obsessions for profit. Other families provided similar testimony about their children who'd been subjected to his protocols. One mother sobbed as she described finding her son dead from a heart attack at 14 after months of stimulant injections. The pattern was undeniable, even though his lawyer kept trying to paint us as willing participants in radical self-improvement. Nathan brought unexpected news the next day that Jade was actually improving at the psychiatric facility. The structured environment and proper medication combined with finally being believed about what happened to us had helped stabilize her. She'd even expressed interest in testifying if needed, which felt like a small miracle in an ocean of tragedy. During my therapy session that week, I told Dr. Williams about my dreams of sleeping normally, just 8 straight hours without fear or chemicals or shocks, and how impossible that seemed. She assured me the body wanted to heal itself and that normal sleep would return eventually, but patience felt impossible when exhaustion was my constant companion. 2 weeks after that, the news exploded with headlines about Dr. Volkov being indicted on 47 counts, including manslaughter, child abuse, fraud, and illegal human experimentation. His lawyer argued he was being scapegoated for parents who went too far in pursuit of optimization, but the evidence was overwhelming. The media ran with headlines like, "Mad scientist uses children as guinea pigs," while more families continued coming forward with their stories of destroyed children and shattered lives. The judge ordered Volkov held without bail while Nathan from CPS arranged my placement with a therapeutic foster family who specialized in trauma cases. Martha and James picked me up from the group home 3 days later in their beat-up minivan that smelled like vanilla air freshener and dog hair. Their house in North Boulder had blackout curtains in every room and soft yellow lamps instead of harsh overhead lights, which made my eyes stop hurting for the first time in years. Martha showed me to a bedroom painted pale blue with a white noise machine on the nightstand and explained they understood I might not sleep much at first. That first night, I paced the hallway from midnight to dawn, my body still programmed to stay awake, while James sat in the living room reading medical journals and occasionally asking if I wanted chamomile tea. Martha found me the next morning organizing their spice rack alphabetically because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and she just smiled and said we could reorganize the whole kitchen if it helped. She started teaching me basic things about sleep that seemed impossible after my upbringing, like how room temperature affected drowsiness and why blue light from screens disrupted natural rhythms. "Your parents turned sleep into the enemy," she said while showing me how to use the programmable thermostat. "We're going to make it your friend again." The biohacking forums exploded with arguments about the case, with some members calling my parents martyrs to the optimization movement, while others distanced themselves from what they called extremist practices. Anonymous packages started arriving at Martha and James's house containing supplements and threatening notes about how I'd destroyed the future of human evolution until police traced them to forum moderators in California. 3 weeks into my placement, Detective Martinez called to say investigators had uncovered disturbing information about Volkov's past. At the DA's office, they showed me documents from medical schools in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, where he'd been expelled for conducting unauthorized experiments on students. His real name was Anton Volkonsky, and he'd fled through Eastern Europe, leaving behind brain-damaged patients and forged credentials before reinventing himself in America's unregulated wellness industry. The prosecutor explained they'd found 17 more families across the country whose children had been subjected to his sleep deprivation protocols, most now suffering from permanent neurological damage. Wait, so Volkov wasn't even his real name? I'm trying to understand how someone with that many fake papers and kicked out of school records could fool so many smart parents. A month later, I was sitting in calculus class trying to relearn basic math when Martha pulled me out saying there was an emergency at the hospital. Dad had suffered a massive stroke, his brain finally giving out after years of stimulant abuse and sleep deprivation. The doctors showed me scans where huge sections of his brain tissue tissue had died, leaving him on life support with no higher brain function. I sat in the hospital chapel staring at the wooden cross on the wall and trying to reconcile the man who used to read me Dr. Seuss books with the one who'd injected me with military-grade stimulants. The hospital chaplain found me there at 3 in the morning and sat quietly while I tried to explain how someone could love their child and torture them at the same time. After 3 days of machines keeping his body alive, I signed the papers to remove life support. I held his hand as the ventilator stopped, whispering that I forgave him even though the words felt hollow in my mouth. He died within 20 minutes, his body too damaged to continue even with mechanical help. The biohacking forums called it murder and said I'd killed him to silence the truth about human optimization, while the ICU nurses hugged me and said I'd shown more mercy than he'd ever shown me. With both parents gone, lawyers started sorting through their estate and discovered Volkov had been draining their accounts for years through bogus research fees. The house where I'd been tortured would need to be sold to cover debts, and their life insurance companies refused to pay out due to the circumstances of their deaths. I met with estate lawyers who explained that my parents had liquidated their retirement accounts to fund Volkov's experiments, leaving nothing but debt and a house full of industrial lighting equipment. Jade got released to a halfway house after 6 months of intensive therapy, and we met for coffee at a shop near the facility. She looked different with color back in her cheeks and steady hands wrapped around her mug, though her eyes still darted to exits like she was planning escape routes. I forgive them, she said suddenly while stirring sugar into her latte. Not for them, but so I can move forward. I stared at my own coffee and admitted I wasn't there yet. That forgiveness felt impossible when I still jumped at sudden noises and couldn't sleep more than 2 hours without nightmares. The trial date arrived 9 months after my parents' deaths, with Volkov's defense team arguing he was a scapegoat for parents who'd gone too far in pursuit of optimization. The prosecutor methodically presented evidence of his decades-long pattern of exploiting desperate families, showing forged credentials and bank records of millions stolen from victims. On the third day of testimony, a woman appeared whom nobody had expected. She introduced herself as Dr. Yelena Fedorova, Volkov's former research assistant from his days in Moscow. She'd fled Russia after witnessing him perform sleep deprivation experiments on orphan children, and she'd brought boxes of documentation including photos, lab notes, and records of families who'd disappeared after entering his program. The courtroom went silent as she described children as young as 3 being kept awake for weeks using electrical shocks and ice baths, their brain development permanently destroyed in the name of creating superior humans. She showed photos of a facility in Siberia where Volkov had operated without oversight, experimenting on children whose parents had been told they were attending an elite boarding school. The scope was so much larger than anyone had imagined, with connections to military research programs and extremist groups across Eastern Europe who believed sleep deprivation could unlock psychic abilities. The prosecutor's presentation went on for hours, each piece of evidence making the jury look more sick. 5 days later, I sat in the witness chair facing Dr. Volkov for the first time since that night. He watched me with those same cold eyes, leaning over to whisper something to his lawyer every few minutes. My hands shook as I described the ice baths at age 5, the strobe lights that gave me seizures, the electric vest that shocked me awake. I showed them the burn scars on my arms from the electrodes. I explained how the injections made my heart race so fast I thought I'd die. The jury stared at me like I was describing something from a horror movie, not my childhood. One woman in the front row started crying when I talked about hallucinating spiders crawling under my skin. Dr. Volkov just sat there taking notes like I was still his test subject. The next morning, his lawyer attacked me hard during cross-examination. He pulled out my medical records showing all the times I'd seen things that weren't there. He asked how anyone could trust someone who admitted to hallucinating for years. I stayed calm and explained that exhaustion hallucinations are different from lying about what happened to me. I remembered every injection, every shock, every experiment because they were real. The hallucinations came later, after days without sleep. He tried to make it sound like I was crazy, but I kept answering his questions with facts. Martha and James sat in the gallery every single day, their presence keeping me grounded. During breaks, Martha would find me in the hallway and remind me to take deep breaths. James always had water bottles and granola bars ready because he noticed I forgot to eat when I was stressed. Having adults who actually cared about my basic needs felt so weird after growing up with parents who thought food and sleep were weaknesses. They never pushed me to talk about the testimony, just made sure I was okay. Other survivors started testifying on day 7. A guy named Tyler described how his parents put him through the same program in Oregon. He showed the court photos of the burns on his back from electric rods his parents used to keep him awake. A woman named Sarah escaped after her younger brother died during a 72-hour wake session. She brought his death certificate showing cardiac arrest at age 14. Family after family told the same story. Parents who met Dr. Volkov at conferences and paid him thousands to experiment on their kids. The pattern was so clear, even Dr. Volkov's lawyer looked uncomfortable. That night in my hotel room, the prosecution showed me what they'd found on Dr. Volkov's encrypted hard drives. Emails to intelligence agencies in Russia and China offering to sell his research on breaking prisoners through sleep deprivation. He called us his assets and test subjects in the messages. One email bragged about how he could make anyone confess to anything after 96 hours without sleep. Another discussed payment terms for a training program where he'd teach interrogators his methods. The jury saw all of it the next day, and Dr. Volkov's face finally showed fear. On day 12, Jade testified through a video link from her treatment facility. Even on the screen, you could see her hands shaking and her eyes darting around like she expected someone to hurt her. She described starting the program at age 10, back when she still trusted our parents. She talked about the competitions they'd have to see who could stay awake longest. She explained how Dr. Volkov increased her doses when her body started adapting. Her voice broke when she said she just wanted to make mom and dad proud, but didn't know they were killing her. The defense tried to salvage things by bringing in character witnesses who knew Dr. Volkov socially. A professor testified that he seemed passionate about human advancement. A woman from his gym said he was always polite. They brought in experts who talked about legitimate biohacking research and tried to separate it from what Dr. Volkov did, but none of them could explain the dead kids, the fake medical license, or the emails about selling torture techniques. During a recess, I went to the bathroom and found 3 biohacking parents waiting in the hallway. They looked at me with such hatred I stepped back. One woman whispered that I'd destroyed something beautiful, that I didn't understand the gift my parents tried to give me. Another said I'd set human evolution back decades. I realized realized these people would never see the truth because they'd invested too much in the lie. They needed to believe the torture was worth it, or admit they'd hurt their own kids for nothing. Dr. Foster testified the next day about examining me in the hospital. She showed the court photos of the injection sites covering my arms, the electrical burns on my torso, the malnutrition from years of surviving on stimulants and protein shakes. She explained how chronic sleep deprivation during puberty had stunted my growth and damaged my brain development. When she said I'd been tortured under the guise of evolution, Dr. Volkov actually laughed. The judge had to call for order. 2 weeks into the trial, I finally slept 5 straight hours without waking up screaming. Martha found me the next morning confused about where I was because I'd never slept that long without chemicals. She had tears in her eyes when she said my body was remembering how to rest. It was the longest I'd slept since I was 5 years old, and my brain felt different, clearer, like fog lifting. James made me a huge breakfast to celebrate, and I actually tasted the food instead of just swallowing it to stay alive. The trial continued for 3 more weeks with witness after witness describing Dr. Volkov's experiments. FBI agents testified about finding his lab equipment and drug supplies. Biochemists explained how his injection cocktails could cause organ failure. Parents who'd lost children to his program sobbed on the stand. Through it all, Dr. Volkov sat there scribbling notes like none of it mattered. But I saw his hands shake when the prosecutor mentioned life in prison. I saw him flinch when they showed photos of the kids who died. He wasn't some brilliant scientist pushing humanity forward. He was just a man who'd found desperate parents willing to pay him to torture their children, and he'd taken the money every time. Volkov's sitting there taking notes while this kid describes torture like he's still collecting data. That whole act of being the misunderstood scientist feels pretty calculated when you see him laughing at brain damage testimony. The closing arguments took 3 days, and watching the prosecutor work was like watching someone slowly peel back layers of horror. She showed the jury photos of kids before and after Dr. Volkov's program, healthy teenagers turned into walking skeletons with 1,000-yard stares. She read from his own research notes where he coldly calculated how many milligrams of stimulants it took to keep a 12-year-old awake for a week straight. The defense lawyer kept trying to paint him as a misguided scientist who got caught up in my parents' delusions, but the evidence was too damning. Bank records showed he'd made over $2 million from desperate parents across the country. The prosecutor pulled up email after email where parents begged him to stop because their kids were having seizures or hallucinating, and he always responded the same way, telling them weakness was trying to reassert itself and they needed to double the doses. On the second day of deliberations, Nathan burst into the courthouse looking pale and grabbed my arm. Dr. Volkov's former research assistant had been found dead in her hotel room, pills scattered across the nightstand, a typed note saying she couldn't live with what she'd helped him do. The judge immediately sequestered the jury, but word spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Other witnesses started looking over their shoulders, whispering about whether it was really suicide or if someone was trying to silence people who knew too much. The parents who'd been ready to testify about their dead kids suddenly wanted police protection. 3 days later, when the jury came back, everyone in the courtroom held their breath. Dr. Volkov sat there scribbling in his notebook like he was still collecting data, not facing the rest of his life in prison. Guilty on all counts. Manslaughter, child abuse, fraud, human experimentation. The list went on and on. The courtroom erupted with people sobbing and hugging while he just kept writing like none of it mattered. 2 weeks before sentencing, I finally went to see my parents' graves. The cemetery was quiet, and their headstones looked so ordinary, just names and dates like they'd been normal people who lived normal lives. I brought flowers for the first time. White roses because Mom had always said they represented purity and new beginnings. Standing there, I told them I survived, that despite everything they'd done, I was still here and still fighting. The anger hadn't faded and probably never would completely, but it wasn't eating me alive anymore. At sentencing, the courtroom was packed with survivors and families of kids who hadn't made it. One by one, they stood up to give victim impact statements, and each story was worse than the last. A mother whose son jumped off a bridge after 6 months in the program because the hallucinations told him he could fly. A father whose daughter's heart gave out at 15 from the constant stimulants. Teenagers with permanent tremors and brain damage who could barely string sentences together. When my turn came, I talked about everything Dr. Volkov had stolen from me and Jade, but also what I was fighting to rebuild. How I was learning to sleep again without nightmares, to trust people who said they wanted to help, to believe I deserved a normal life. The judge gave him 45 years to life, and as the guards put him in handcuffs, he looked at me one last time and said, I could have been extraordinary. I looked him straight in the eye and told him I already was because I'd survived him. The whole courtroom started clapping as they led him away. The biohacking community completely fell apart after the trial. Some members went public with apologies, admitting they'd ignored obvious warning signs because they wanted so badly to believe in human enhancement. Others disappeared underground, moving their experiments to countries with fewer regulations. Nathan warned me to stay careful because true believers rarely give up their obsessions, they just find new ways to pursue them. He'd already gotten reports of parents trying to recreate Dr. Volkov's protocols using instructions they'd downloaded from dark web forums. Jade and I started family therapy together 6 months after the trial, both of us trying to figure out who we were without our parents' shadow hanging over us. She'd started painting in her residential program, these beautiful abstract pieces full of color and movement. The therapist said art was helping her brain form new pathways after all the damage from sleep deprivation. I was learning to trust slowly, to believe that Nathan really wanted to help, and my foster parents weren't secretly planning experiments. We talked about our parents sometimes, trying to understand how they'd gone from wanting to give us advantages to destroying us in pursuit of some impossible dream. School started that fall at a small alternative program for kids with trauma histories. The first day I walked in expecting to be the weird one, but quickly realized everyone there had stories. Kids who'd been trafficked, who'd survived abuse, who'd seen things no teenager should see. My story about parents who wouldn't let me sleep didn't even rank in the top 5 strangest. The teachers understood when someone had a panic attack or couldn't focus because of flashbacks. They taught us coping skills along with math and English. While cleaning out my parents' storage unit, I found boxes of journals from before they met Dr. Volkov. Reading them was like watching a slow-motion car crash. They started out writing about wanting to help their future children succeed, to give us every advantage in a competitive world. Then the entries got darker as they discovered biohacking forums and started experimenting on themselves. By the time they had me, they were already convinced that sleep was just a habit that could be broken broken with enough willpower. The descent from concerned parents to true believers happened so gradually, they probably never noticed when they crossed the line into madness. The therapy sessions with Dr. Davis started 3 months after the trial ended, and at first I could barely talk without shaking, but she never rushed me, and slowly I learned to process what happened without feeling like I was drowning. We worked through the guilt about my parents being in psychiatric facilities, and the trauma of years of sleep deprivation, and by our last session 2 years later, I could finally say the words out loud, that I was a survivor, not a victim. "You rewrote your story," she said simply, and those 3 words meant everything. The crisis hotline volunteering came next because I needed to help others the way people had helped me, and when a scared voice described parents forcing extreme diets on their kids, I knew exactly what resources to share and how to make them feel believed. One afternoon, Jade and I finally went through the storage unit with our parents' things and found photos from before the obsession took over. Pictures of them holding us as babies with normal, loving smiles, and we kept those few reminders that they were once capable of regular love while donating or throwing away all the biohacking equipment and research papers. 4 years after the trial, I walked across the stage at my college graduation with Martha, James, and Jade, cheering from the audience, and my social work degree felt like armor against ever letting abuse go unnoticed again. Graduate school acceptance came next for a program specializing in family trauma and extremist dynamics because I wanted to understand the psychology behind what happened to us. At a coffee shop near campus, I ran into a woman who used to attend my parents' biohacking meetups, and she apologized for celebrating what she now recognized as child abuse. But I kept the conversation short because some bridges were meant to stay burned. Moving into my first apartment meant hanging blackout curtains and buying the softest bedding I could find because 8 hours of sleep every night was my daily rebellion against their legacy. The PTSD symptoms still hit sometimes, like jumping at unexpected noises or feeling phantom shocks from the vest, but therapy techniques and medication when needed helped me manage the hypervigilance that kept me safe but also exhausted. Jade called one evening practically screaming with excitement about getting into art school, and her portfolio of abstract paintings based on our experience showed how she was turning pain into something beautiful, just like I was turning it into helping others. The Cult Recovery Conference invited me to speak about family extremism, and afterwards parents approached with questions about concerning patterns in their own communities. So I shared resources and emphasized how extremism often disguised itself as wellness or self-improvement. Leading my first support group at the community center felt like coming full circle as I looked at the faces around me, including a teenager escaping religious fundamentalism and a woman whose parents joined a doomsday cult, and others with stories both unique and heartbreakingly familiar. Recovery isn't linear, I told them, remembering my own journey through courts and therapy and learning to sleep again. But you survived the worst, and that means you're stronger than you know. As they shared their stories, I thought about mom and dad in their separate facilities, getting treatment they should have gotten years ago, and Dr. Volkov serving his prison sentence, and Jade creating art from ashes, and my own path from victim to advocate. The trauma shaped me, but it didn't define me anymore, and now I helped others find their way out of darkness by staying in the light myself and showing them it was possible to rebuild after everything fell apart. Time really flies when you're out here dropping truth bombs together. Appreciate you letting me sprinkle a little wit on the ride. Catch you on the flip side. Subscribe for more content like this.